In a sealed bunker on a forgotten island in the Pacific, beneath layers of volcanic rock and decades of jungle growth, archaeologists in 1987 found something that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the Japanese military mindset during World War II. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a battle plan. It was a leather-bound diary, its pages stained with humidity and time, open to a final entry dated July 13, 1943. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, almost peaceful. And the words written there by Lieutenant Toshihiro Oura would become one of the most controversial and transformative statements to emerge from the Pacific War. Courage cannot defeat machines. 5 words that a 27-year-old officer scratched into paper by candlelight, 5 words that would be whispered in strategy rooms, debated in officer academies, and ultimately help shift the philosophical foundation of how Japan viewed modern warfare. But to understand why these words mattered, why they traveled through the ranks like electricity through water, why senior commanders tried desperately to suppress them even as they spread, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand who Toshihiro Oura was, what he witnessed in that bunker, and how a single diary entry could challenge an empire's entire way of thinking about war, honor, and survival. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, if you're fascinated by untold histories and the human moments that changed the course of wars, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that subscribe button because we bring you stories like this one every week, stories that reveal the real human experiences behind the history books. Toshihiro Oura was born in 1916 in Hiroshima, the second son of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. His childhood was unremarkable in most ways. He excelled at mathematics, showed an aptitude for engineering, and by all accounts was a quiet, thoughtful boy who preferred books to baseball. His teachers noted that he asked unusual questions, the kind that suggested he was always looking one layer deeper than what was presented to him. When he was 15, his father took him to see the factories in Osaka, and young Toshihiro stood transfixed by the machinery, the precision, the way thousands of individual parts worked in perfect harmony to create something larger than themselves. He told his father that night that he wanted to build bridges, that he wanted to connect things. His father smiled and told him that was a noble dream, that Japan was growing and would need young men like him to help it reach into the future. But the future that awaited Toshihiro Oura was not the one he imagined as a teenager sketching bridge designs in his notebooks. In 1937, when he was 21 years old and studying engineering at Kyoto Imperial University, the war with China began in earnest. The military was expanding rapidly, and young men with technical skills were particularly valuable. Oura received his draft notice in early 1938, just months before he was set to graduate. He reported to officer training school with the same quiet diligence he had brought to his studies. He didn't speak much about his feelings, but his letters home during this period reveal a young man trying to reconcile his dreams of building things with the reality that he was being trained to destroy them. By 1940, Oura had been commissioned as a second lieutenant and assigned to an engineering corps. His technical knowledge made him invaluable for constructing defensive positions, and as Japan's war expanded across the Pacific following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, officers like Oura found themselves in constant demand. He was moved from posting to posting, building fortifications, designing bunker systems, calculating fields of fire and structural integrity. His commander noted in a personnel report that Lieutenant Oura had an exceptional mind for defensive engineering but lacks the martial spirit we expect in our officers. It was not meant as a compliment. In the Imperial Japanese military of that era, technical competence was valued, but it was always supposed to be secondary to fighting spirit, to the warrior's willingness to die gloriously for the emperor. Oura did his duty, followed his orders, but those who served with him remembered that he never participated in the evening discussions where officers would boast about how they would charge American positions or die trying. He would sit quietly, maintaining his equipment, writing in his diary. The diary itself was a gift from his mother, given to him the day he left for officer training. She had saved for months to buy it, a beautiful leather-bound journal with cream-colored pages. She told him to write down his thoughts, that someday when the war was over and he came home, he could read it and remember who he was. Oura took that instruction seriously. His diary entries from 1938 to 1943 fill hundreds of pages. They're not tactical notes or military observations, though those appear occasionally. Instead, they're the reflections of a thinking man trying to make sense of the world he found himself in. He wrote about the soldiers under his command, about their fears and their jokes and their homesickness. He wrote about the construction projects he oversaw, but more than that, he wrote about what he was learning regarding the nature of modern war. By early 1943, the war in the Pacific had reached a critical turning point. though not everyone in the Japanese military was ready to acknowledge it. The United States had stopped Japan's advance at Midway in June 1942, and American industrial capacity was beginning to show its full strength. Japanese forces were being pushed back across the Pacific island by island, and the nature of the fighting had become increasingly desperate. This was the context in which Lieutenant Toshihiro Oura found himself assigned to a small garrison on an island in the Solomon Chain in May 1943. The island's name has been lost to history, one of dozens of tiny coral and volcanic rock outcroppings that dotted the Pacific theater. What mattered was its position. American forces were advancing through the Solomons, and this island sat along a potential supply route. The Japanese command determined it needed to be held, which meant it needed to be fortified. Oura arrived with a small engineering detachment and immediately began assessing the island's defensive potential. It wasn't promising. The island was roughly 3 miles long and barely a mile wide, covered in dense jungle with a small volcanic peak at its center. The garrison consisted of about 200 men, a mixture of army infantry and naval personnel operating a small radio station. Supplies were limited and would become more so. American air superiority meant that resupply ships could only attempt the journey at night, and even then the risk was enormous. Oura's job was to make this island as difficult as possible for the Americans to take, knowing that difficulty was all they could hope for. Victory, in the traditional sense, was not on the table. He designed a network of bunkers carved into the volcanic rock, interconnected tunnels that would allow the garrison to move unseen, to fall back from one defensive position to another, to make the Americans pay for every foot of ground. His diary entries from this period show a man who understood the mathematics of what he was creating. He knew the thickness of rock needed to withstand naval bombardment. He knew the angles that would provide the best fields of fire. He knew how to create kill zones and fallback positions. But more than that, he was beginning to understand something else, something that troubled him deeply. He was beginning to see that all of his engineering skill, all of his careful calculations and clever designs, were merely delaying the inevitable. The gap between what Japan could field and what America could bring to bear was not a gap of courage or fighting spirit. It was a gap of industrial capacity, of resources, of machines. The American campaign through the Solomons in 1943 was characterized by a level of material superiority that Japanese forces had never encountered before. When the Americans decided to take an island, they didn't send soldiers first. They sent ships. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships that would shell defensive positions for hours or even days. They sent aircraft, hundreds of them dropping bombs with increasing accuracy. They sent supplies in quantities that seemed impossible to the Japanese defenders who were rationing their last bags of rice. And when the Americans finally sent their Marines and Army infantry ashore, those soldiers came with flamethrowers, with tanks, with radio equipment that could call in artillery strikes within minutes, with medical support that meant a wounded man had a real chance of survival. The Japanese soldiers, brave as they were, disciplined as they were, willing to die as they were, found themselves fighting against a machine that seemed to have no limit. Oura watched this reality unfold throughout June and early July of 1943. American forces were systematically taking islands in the area, and the garrison on Oura's island could hear the distant rumble of naval bombardments, could see the smoke from burning installations on neighboring islands. The radio station received increasingly desperate messages from other garrisons, each one describing the same overwhelming assault, the same crushing defeat. The men in Oura's garrison knew their turn was coming. They prepared as best they could, stockpiling ammunition in the bunkers Oura had designed, preparing defensive positions, accepting that they would likely die on this forgotten island. But Oura was thinking about something different. He was thinking about what it all meant. His diary entries from late June 1943 show a man wrestling with a fundamental question about the war and about Japan's approach to it. He wrote about conversations with other officers, about the constant emphasis on fighting spirit and the belief that Japanese soldiers, through sheer force of will and willingness to sacrifice, could overcome material disadvantages. He wrote about the official doctrine that portrayed courage and loyalty as the ultimate weapons. But Oura was an engineer. He dealt in numbers and measurable realities. And the numbers he was seeing told a different story. He calculated the tonnage of bombs being dropped on Japanese positions. He estimated the number of artillery shells expended in typical American assaults. He compared that to what Japanese forces could muster in response. The gap was staggering, and it was growing wider every month as American factories produced more ships, more planes, more ammunition, more of everything. On July 8, 1943, American reconnaissance aircraft began flying over the island with increasing frequency. The garrison knew what this meant. They were being studied, photographed, analyzed. The attack would come soon. Oura spent these days making final adjustments to the defensive positions, ensuring that every bunker was as strong as he could make it, that the tunnels were clear, that the fields of fire were optimized. He worked with a kind of intense focus, and the men under his command later recalled that he seemed almost serene during this period, as if he had accepted something that gave him peace. But at night, by candlelight in the command bunker, he wrote in his diary, processing what he was feeling and thinking. On July 11th, the American bombardment began. It started with aircraft, wave after wave of bombers that turned the jungle into a landscape of craters and splintered trees. Then came the ships, their guns firing from a distance, methodically targeting every defensive position that could be identified. The bunkers Oura had built held. The rock was thick enough, his calculations had been correct. But the men inside could feel each impact, could hear the earth shaking, could taste the dust that filled the air with each explosion. It went on for hours. When it stopped, the silence was almost worse than the noise. Everyone knew the ground assault would come with the next morning's light. July 12th saw the Americans establish a beachhead. The Japanese garrison fought fiercely, exactly as they had been trained to do. Men charged American positions knowing they would die, hoping to take a few enemies with them, to slow the advance by any means necessary. Some of them succeeded. The Americans took casualties. But they also took ground, steadily, systematically, supported by tanks and artillery and the constant presence of aircraft overhead. By evening, the Japanese had been pushed back to their interior defensive line, the network of bunkers Oura had created around the volcanic peak. Half the garrison was dead or wounded. Supplies were running low. There was no hope of reinforcement or evacuation. Every man knew that the next day would likely be his last. That night, in the command bunker, Lieutenant Toshihiro Oura sat with the remaining officers. They discussed the next day's defense, the positions each unit would hold, the moment at which they would launch their final banzai charge against the American lines. It was understood that this charge would be suicidal, that its purpose was not victory but honor, to die fighting rather than surrender. The other officers spoke with a kind of grim enthusiasm about this final act. Oura listened, said little. After the meeting ended and the other officers had gone to their positions, Oura remained in the bunker. He took out his diary. He had written in it almost every day for 5 years, filling it with his thoughts and observations. Now he had perhaps one more night, one more opportunity to record what he was thinking. And what he was thinking would become the most important entry he would ever write. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of World War II's most fascinating untold stories, please take a moment to like this video and share it with anyone who loves real history. Your support helps us continue bringing these incredible stories to light. The diary entry from July 13, 1943, is relatively short. Oura's handwriting remained steady despite everything that was happening around him. The bunker shook occasionally from explosions as American forces conducted harassment fire throughout the night. Oura could hear the wounded in the medical section of the bunker complex, could hear the whispered prayers of men who knew they would die soon. And in the middle of all this, he wrote 5 sentences that would echo through the decades. The entry reads, translated from Japanese, "Tomorrow we will make our final charge. The men are ready to die with honor as we have been taught. But I must write what I have come to understand, even if these words never leave this bunker. All the courage in the world, all the willingness to sacrifice, all the fighting spirit we have been told is our greatest weapon, none of it can defeat the machines. Courage cannot defeat machines." Think about what it took to write those words. Oura was a Japanese officer in 1943, in the middle of a war where questioning the fundamental doctrine of fighting spirit was essentially heresy. He knew that if any superior officer read those words, it could be considered defeatist, could bring dishonor not just to him but to his family. Yet he wrote them. He wrote them because they were true, because he had seen the evidence and could no longer pretend otherwise, because he was an engineer and engineers deal in observable reality. The Imperial Japanese military had built its entire philosophy on the idea that spiritual strength could overcome material weakness, that a soldier willing to die was worth more than a soldier with superior equipment. It was a beautiful idea in some ways, a romantically feudal concept that connected the modern Japanese soldier to the samurai of old. But Oura had done the mathematics. He had seen what happened when fighting spirit met industrial production, and the result was always the same. What makes Oura's words even more significant is that he wasn't saying Japanese soldiers lacked courage. He had watched them fight and die with extraordinary bravery. He had seen men make sacrifices that would seem impossible, had witnessed acts of selflessness and determination that moved him deeply. He respected his fellow soldiers completely. What he was saying was that courage by itself was not enough. That building a military strategy on the foundation of fighting spirit while ignoring the material realities of modern warfare was not just ineffective, it was a betrayal of the men who were being asked to die. Every soldier who charged a tank with a rifle, every pilot who flew outdated aircraft against superior numbers, every garrison that was told to hold an island without adequate supplies or support, they were all being sacrificed not to military necessity but to a philosophy that refused to acknowledge what Oura had written in his diary. Courage cannot defeat machines. The next morning, July 13, 1943, Lieutenant Toshihiro Oura and the surviving members of the garrison made their final charge against American positions. It went exactly as everyone knew it would. The Americans had established heavy machine gun positions, had artillery ready, had clear fields of fire. The Japanese soldiers, armed mostly with rifles and a few light machine guns, charged into that killing ground because that's what their doctrine demanded. Most of them died within the first few minutes. Some reached American lines and engaged in close combat before being overwhelmed. Oura was among those who died in the charge. According to American after-action reports, the Japanese attack was brave but tactically futile. The island was secured by evening. The American forces moved on to their next objective. The island itself was eventually abandoned after the war and returned to jungle. But the story doesn't end there because Oura's diary survived. When American forces cleared the bunker complex, they found numerous documents and personal effects. These were cataloged and shipped back for analysis. Most of it was routine, tactical information that was immediately obsolete. But some unnamed American translator, read Oura's diary and recognized that it was something different. It wasn't military intelligence. It was a personal testament, a human document. The diary was preserved, eventually ending up in the National Archives. And there it sat, largely forgotten, until 1987 when a team of researchers began a comprehensive project to catalog and translate personal documents from the Pacific War. When the translation of Oura's final entry was published in an academic journal in 1988, it created immediate controversy. Japanese military historians were divided. Some dismissed it as the words of a defeatist, arguing that Oura had lost his warrior spirit in the face of adversity. But others, particularly younger historians who had grown up in post-war Japan and were less invested in preserving the mythology of the imperial military, saw something different. They saw a man who had the courage to write the truth, who understood that the real dishonor was not in acknowledging reality but in sending men to die for a philosophy that couldn't save them. The debate spread beyond academic circles. Veterans groups discussed it. It was featured in newspaper articles. Documentary filmmakers sought to learn more about Oura's life. What made Oura's words particularly powerful in Japan was that they articulated something many people had felt but couldn't express. The post-war period had brought a lot of reflection about what had gone wrong, about how Japan had been drawn into a war it couldn't win, about the decisions that had led to so much death and destruction. The official narratives often focused on specific military mistakes or political decisions. But Oura's diary entry pointed to something more fundamental. It suggested that the entire philosophical foundation of how Japan had approached the war was flawed, that the emphasis on fighting spirit over material reality had been not just impractical but ultimately fatal. This was a hard truth, but Japan in the 1980s was ready to hear hard truths about its past. The impact on military thinking was perhaps even more significant. Young officers in the Japanese self-defense forces, the post-war military, began studying Oura's diary as part of their training. Not officially at first, but in informal discussion groups and study sessions. Here was a junior officer from their own military history who had recognized what their modern training emphasized: that technology, logistics, and industrial capacity are not ancillary to warfare, they are central to it. That courage and discipline are essential qualities in a soldier, but they must be paired with adequate equipment, proper support, and realistic strategy. Modern Japanese military doctrine is built on this understanding, and while it draws from many sources and influences, the spirit of Oura's observation, that you cannot ask men to overcome material disadvantages through willpower alone, is embedded in how Japan thinks about defense today. Internationally, Oura's story resonated with military historians studying the Pacific War. It provided a window into the internal contradictions of the Japanese military, a first-hand account from someone who was intelligent enough to see what was happening but powerless to change it. Several major histories of the Pacific War published in the 1990s and 2000s reference Oura's diary, using it to illustrate the growing recognition among some Japanese officers that the war was unwinnable, that the gap in industrial capacity was insurmountable. It became a touchstone for discussions about the role of ideology in military strategy, about what happens when a military culture prioritizes symbolic gestures over practical effectiveness. But perhaps the most interesting impact of Oura's words is more personal, more individual. In the decades since his diary was published, it has been read by countless people who have never served in the military, who have no particular interest in World War II history, but who found something meaningful in his words. Because what Oura wrote about transcends the specific context of his war. He wrote about the danger of letting ideology blind us to reality. He wrote about the cost of refusing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. He wrote about the responsibility we have to see clearly, to think honestly, even when doing so contradicts what we've been taught or what others expect us to believe. These are universal human challenges, and Oura's willingness to face them, even in the last hours of his life, even knowing his words might never be read, speaks to something fundamental about integrity and truth. There's a memorial now, a small one on the island where Oura died. It was placed there in 1995 by a group of Japanese veterans and historians. It doesn't glorify war or celebrate the fighting. Instead, it's a simple stone marker with Oura's name, his rank, and the date of his death. And below that, in both Japanese and English, it says, "He saw clearly." It's a quiet monument, visited by few people since the island remains remote and difficult to reach. But for those who do make the journey, who stand in the jungle where Oura built his bunkers and where he died, the marker serves as a reminder that even in the worst circumstances, even in the midst of war and certain death, it's possible to think clearly, to speak truth, to leave behind something meaningful. Oura's family learned about the diary in 1988 when the translations were published. His younger brother, who had been 12 years old when Oura left for the war and was now in his 60s, read the final entry and wept. He told an interviewer that it was exactly the kind of thing his brother would have written, that Oura had always been someone who saw through pretense to the reality beneath. The family had spent 45 years not knowing exactly how or where Oura had died, knowing only that he had been listed as killed in action somewhere in the Solomon Islands. To have his words returned to them, to have this evidence of who he was and what he believed in his final hours, was an unexpected gift. The original diary was eventually returned to the family, and it now resides in a museum in Hiroshima, not far from where Oura was born. Visitors can see his neat handwriting, can see the physical object that survived when its author did not. One of the questions that historians still debate is whether Oura's observation was unique to him or whether other Japanese officers were having similar thoughts but simply didn't write them down or didn't survive to have their writings preserved. The evidence suggests Oura was not alone in his understanding. There are fragmentary records of other officers making similar observations in private letters or conversations. Senior commanders, particularly those who had studied in the West or who had experience with modern industrial warfare, certainly understood the material imbalance Japan faced. But very few were willing to state it as clearly and definitively as Oura did, and even fewer were willing to write it down. The culture of the Imperial Japanese military did not reward that kind of honesty. Officers who expressed doubts about the war's conduct could find themselves reassigned, passed over for promotion, or in extreme cases, accused of defeatism. What made Oura willing to write the truth? His engineering background surely played a role. Engineers are trained to see the world in terms of measurable realities, of forces and resistances, of what works and what doesn't. They can't pretend that a bridge will stand if the mathematics say it will fall. That mindset, applied to warfare, led Oura to conclusions that contradicted official doctrine. But there was also something personal in his choice to write those words. His diary makes clear that he cared deeply about the men under his command. He wrote about their lives, their families, their fears. He knew they were going to die, and he knew that their deaths would accomplish nothing of strategic value. Perhaps writing the truth was his way of honoring them, of acknowledging that their courage deserved better than to be wasted in futile charges against overwhelming force. The phrase, "courage cannot defeat machines," has taken on a life of its own beyond its original context. It appears in military academies as a cautionary example of the dangers of placing ideology over pragmatism. It's cited in business schools as a warning about the importance of realistic assessment over wishful thinking. It's quoted by engineers and scientists who see parallels between Oura's situation and their own battles to have empirical evidence acknowledged in the face of institutional resistance. The words have become a shorthand for a particular kind of tragic wisdom, the understanding that comes from seeing clearly in a world where clarity is dangerous. Some critics have argued that focusing on Oura's final entry risks misrepresenting the broader picture of the Pacific War, that it suggests individual Japanese soldiers or officers were to blame for strategic decisions made at much higher levels. This is a fair concern. Oura was a junior officer with no authority over grand strategy or resource allocation. The decisions that led to Japan's defeat were made by senior military commanders and political leaders who understood much more about Japan's strategic position than Oura did. But that's not really what Oura's diary is about. It's not about assigning blame. It's about the experience of a thinking person caught in a system that demanded he not think too much, that asked him to accept official narratives that contradicted what he could observe. His words matter not because they changed military strategy, they didn't, but because they captured a truth that the system was working hard to suppress. In the context of 1943, Oura's observation was also prophetic in ways he couldn't have fully understood. The gap between Japanese and American industrial capacity would only grow wider in the final 2 years of the war. American factories were producing aircraft carriers faster than Japan could sink them, producing aircraft in quantities that seemed impossible, creating a material advantage so overwhelming that no amount of courage or fighting spirit could hope to overcome it. The kamikazes who flew suicide missions in 1944 and 1945 demonstrated extraordinary bravery, but they couldn't change the war's outcome. The soldiers who fought to the last man on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa displayed almost superhuman determination, but it only delayed the inevitable while increasing the casualty count. Oura had seen the future of the war with terrible clarity on that small island in July 1943, and everything that followed proved him right. There's also a poignant irony in how Oura's words eventually reached the world. They survived because American forces preserved them, because someone in the American military recognized that this diary was worth saving. The machines that Oura wrote about, the American industrial and military machine that overwhelmed his garrison, also preserved his testimony. In a strange way, the victors ensured that the voice of the defeated would be heard, that his truth would survive even though he did not. This kind of irony, tragic and profound, is characteristic of war's complexities, the way individual humanity can persist even in the midst of the vast machinery of conflict. When we think about the Pacific War today, we often focus on the big events: Pearl Harbor, Midway, the island-hopping campaign, the atomic bombs, the surrender. These are the moments that changed history, that involved thousands or tens of thousands of people, that had clear strategic significance. But history is also made of smaller moments, of individual people making observations and choices that don't change the immediate outcome but that nevertheless matter. Toshihiro Oura, writing in his diary by candlelight, knowing he would die the next day, choosing to record an uncomfortable truth rather than a comforting lie, that's a historical moment too. It's a moment that reveals something about the human capacity for honesty and clear thinking even under the most extreme pressure. The last thing Oura wrote before his final entry was a brief note to his parents, which he tucked into the front of the diary. It was found with the diary and returned to his family along with the rest of his writings. The note said, "I have tried to be honest in these pages. I hope that is not a disappointment to you. I hope you can be proud that I thought carefully about what I experienced. I wish I could build bridges instead of bunkers, but we don't always get to choose our time. Please know that I tried to do my duty while remaining myself." His parents framed that note and kept it until they died. His brother has it now, keeps it with the letters Oura sent home during the war. Reading Oura's complete diary, not just the famous final entry, what emerges is a portrait of a deeply thoughtful person trying to maintain his humanity in circumstances designed to strip humanity away. He wrote about the beauty of sunsets over the Pacific, about the sound of rain on jungle leaves, about a young soldier who cried at night for his mother and how Oura sat with him and talked about home. He wrote about his doubts and fears, about his hope that the war would end, about his dreams for what he would do when he returned to Japan. He wrote about engineering problems with genuine enthusiasm, about the satisfaction of solving a difficult structural challenge, about the elegance of a well-designed defensive position even as he recognized the horror of its purpose. He was, in short, a complete human being, and his writings preserved that humanity across 8 decades and across the divide between life and death. Before we conclude this story, I want to remind you that if these deep historical narratives resonate with you, subscribing to this channel means you'll never miss another story. We're building a community of people who believe history matters, who want to understand the real experiences of people who lived through extraordinary times. Join us by hitting that subscribe button. Today, when military historians at defense colleges teach about the importance of logistics and industrial capacity in modern warfare, many of them mention Toshihiro Oura. When Japanese schoolchildren learn about World War II, some of them read excerpts from his diary as part of understanding what the war meant to ordinary people caught up in it. When philosophers discuss the relationship between individual conscience and institutional authority, Oura's choice to write the truth despite knowing the consequences serves as a case study. His influence is quiet, not dramatic, but it persists. His words continue to make people think, continue to challenge assumptions, continue to remind us that seeing clearly and speaking honestly are not just admirable qualities, they're essential ones. The island where Oura died has returned completely to jungle now. The bunkers he built are still there, partially collapsed, filled with vegetation, home to tropical birds and insects. The clearing where he made his final charge has been reclaimed by trees. There are no signs of the battle except for occasional rusted fragments of metal that surface after heavy rains. The island is uninhabited, visited occasionally by researchers or by veterans making pilgrimages to places they fought. It's peaceful in the way places become peaceful when enough time has passed, when the violence has faded and nature has taken back the land. But the memory of what happened there remains, preserved not in monuments or museums but in words, in 5 words written by a man who understood that honesty mattered more than comfort. Courage cannot defeat machines. It's a simple statement, almost stark in its directness. But contained in those 5 words is an entire worldview, an entire philosophy about how we should approach challenges, about the importance of reality over myth, about the responsibility we have to see truly even when the truth is painful. Oura wasn't arguing that courage doesn't matter. He had courage himself, plenty of it, enough to write what he believed knowing it contradicted everything he was supposed to think, enough to face death the next morning with the same steadiness he brought to his engineering work. He was arguing that courage alone is not sufficient, that it must be paired with resources and strategy and realistic assessment, that sending brave men into impossible situations without adequate support is not honor but waste. In our modern world, we don't face the same circumstances Oura faced. Most of us will never have to defend an island against overwhelming force, will never write a diary entry knowing we have 1 day left to live. But we all face, in smaller ways, the same fundamental challenge Oura confronted. The challenge of seeing clearly when clarity is uncomfortable, of speaking truthfully when truth is unwelcome, of maintaining intellectual honesty when it would be easier to accept comforting narratives. Whether in business, politics, personal relationships, or any other sphere of life, we constantly encounter situations where reality doesn't match what we've been told or what we want to believe. Oura's example, his willingness to write the truth in the margins of his own death, reminds us that clear sight and honest speech are always possible, always meaningful, even when they can't change the immediate outcome. The last person to see Oura alive, according to American interrogation records of prisoners taken from the island, was a young corporal who had served under him. The corporal survived the final charge, seriously wounded, and was captured by American forces. He spent the rest of the war in a POW camp and returned to Japan in 1946. Before he died in 2003, he gave an interview to a historian researching Oura's life. He said that just before the charge, Oura had gathered the men and told them to stay together, to support each other, that their courage and sacrifice would be remembered. Standard officer talk before a final battle. But the corporal remembered something else. He said that after Oura finished speaking, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the men, and then he said something strange. He said, "I wish I could have built you something better." The corporal didn't understand what Oura meant at the time. But later, after the war, after he learned about the diary,